before we begin our deep dive into the labyrinthine and blood-soaked life of the man who would become the most notorious criminal of the 20th century, a crucial disclaimer is necessary. The narrative you are about to hear is not a work of fiction. It is a meticulously compiled account pieced together from thousands of pages of court documents, declassified government files, investigative journalism, biographies written by his associates and enemies, and the harrowing testimonies of his victims. This story is presented with the sole objective of delivering a complete, unvarnished, and accurate historical record to you, the listener. Its purpose is to educate and inform, to shed light on the complex mechanisms of power, corruption, and violence that defined an era, not to glorify the horrific acts committed. The name Pablo Escobar has become synonymous with a level of audacious criminality and brutal power that is almost mythical in its scale. But it is vital to remember that behind the legend lies a trail of countless shattered lives, a nation held hostage, and a profound moral darkness. So, if you are prepared to embark on this long and often disturbing journey into the heart of a modern-day empire built on cocaine and corpses, please settle in. Prepare to witness the rise, reign, and fall of the ruthless emperor. And if you find this detailed exploration compelling, remember that your engagement fuels this channel's mission to bring you the most thorough historical content. So do subscribe and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Now, let us turn back the clock to a time before the billions, before the notoriety, to the very beginning. In the rugged, mountainous terrain of Colombia, the story of Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria does not begin with the roar of gunfire or the sleek hull of a cocaine-laden speedboat, but in the quiet, unassuming municipality of Rio Negro, Colombia, on the 1st of December, 1949. He was born into a family of modest means, the third of 7 children to Abel de Jesses Dari Escobar, a humble farmer, and Hermilda de los Dolores Gaviria Berrio, a dedicated school teacher. This contrast between his parents, the earthy, simple campesino, and the educated, aspirational teacher, would create a fascinating dynamic in young Pablo's life. Shortly after his birth, the family relocated to the city of Medellín, a place that would become both his kingdom and his battleground. They settled in the working-class neighborhood of Envigado, a district that, while not the absolute poorest, was far from the gleaming centers of power and wealth. It was here, in the dusty, winding streets of a city nestled in the Aburra Valley, that the first seeds of his future empire were sown. From a very young age, Pablo exhibited a complex duality that would define his entire life. To his mother, he was a devoted son, affectionate and caring, harboring a deep-seated fear of poverty, or pobreza, a word that would become his lifelong motivator and greatest terror. He famously promised his mother that one day he would give her everything she desired, and that he would one day become president of Colombia. This ambition, fueled by a desperate desire to escape the confines of his social class, was the noble side of the coin. The other side was visible on the streets. As a teenager, Pablo was not just a mischievous boy. He was a budding entrepreneur with a blatant disregard for the law He began his criminal career not with drugs, but with petty crimes. He would steal tombstones from the local cemetery, sanding off the inscriptions and reselling them to desperate families at a discount. A macabre and cynical business that displayed a chilling lack of empathy from the very start. He later graduated to stealing cars and selling counterfeit lottery tickets, demonstrating an early understanding of illicit markets and a willingness to exploit any opportunity, no matter how deceitful. It was during this time that he allegedly got his famous nickname, E.L. Doctor, a moniker of respect that would later be uttered with fear across the continent. His first major foray into the drug trade was not with cocaine, but with marijuana. He began by acting as a small-time smuggler and enforcer, but his sharp mind quickly recognized the limitations of this trade. The real future, the astronomical profits, lay in a different, purer, and more potent substance, cocaine hydrochloride. The early 1970s saw the dawn of the cocaine boom in the United States, and Pablo Escobar, with his innate cunning, ruthless ambition, and a network of contacts he was rapidly building, was perfectly positioned to ride that wave. He started small, establishing rudimentary processing labs in the jungles of Colombia and Peru, but his vision was grand. He understood that to control the market, he needed to control the entire supply chain, from the coca fields in Peru and Bolivia to the noses of consumers in Miami and Los Angeles. This was the genesis of the Medellín Cartel, a business model so brutally efficient and profitable that it would, for a time, make him one of the richest and most powerful men in the world. He was no longer a tombstone thief from Envigado. He was a businessman, a trafficker, an emerging kingpin, and he was just getting started. The story of Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria does not begin with the roar of gunfire or the sleek hull of a cocaine-laden speedboat, but in the quiet, unassuming municipality of Rio Negro, Colombia, on the 1st of December, 1949. He was born into a family of modest means, the third of 7 children to Abel de Jesus Dari Escobar, a humble farmer, and Hermilda de los Dolores Gaviria Berrio, a dedicated schoolteacher. This contrast between his parents, the earthy, simple campesino, and the educated, aspirational teacher, would create a fascinating dynamic in young Pablo's life. Shortly after his birth, the family relocated to the city of Medellín, a place that would become both his kingdom and his battleground. They settled in the working-class neighborhood of Envigado, a district that, while not the absolute poorest, was far from the gleaming centers of power and wealth. It was here, in the dusty, winding streets of a city nestled in the Abura Valley, that the first seeds of his future empire were sown. From a very young age, Pablo exhibited a complex duality that would define his entire life. To his mother, he was a devoted son, affectionate and caring, harboring a deep-seated fear of poverty, or pobreza, a word that would become his lifelong motivator and greatest terror. He famously promised his mother that one day he would give her everything she desired, and that he would one day become president of Colombia. This ambition, fueled by a desperate desire to escape the confines of his social class, was the noble side of the coin. The The other side was visible on the streets. As a teenager, Pablo was not just a mischievous boy. He was a budding entrepreneur with a blatant disregard for the law. He began his criminal career not with drugs, but with petty crimes. He would steal tombstones from the local cemetery, sanding off the inscriptions and reselling them to desperate families at a discount. A macabre and cynical business that displayed a chilling lack of empathy from the very start. He later graduated to stealing cars and selling counterfeit lottery tickets, demonstrating an early understanding of illicit markets and a willingness to exploit any opportunity, no matter how deceitful. It was during this time that he allegedly got his famous nickname, E.L. Doctor, a moniker of respect that would later be uttered with fear across the continent. His first major foray into the drug trade was not with cocaine, but with marijuana. He began by acting as a small-time smuggler and enforcer, but his sharp mind quickly recognized the limitations of this trade. The real future, the astronomical profits, lay in a different, purer, and more potent substance, cocaine hydrochloride. The early 1970s saw the dawn of the cocaine boom in the United States, and Pablo Escobar, with his innate cunning, ruthless ambition, and a network of contacts he was rapidly building, was perfectly positioned to ride that wave. He started small, establishing rudimentary processing labs in the jungles of Colombia and Peru. But his vision was grand. He understood that to control the market, he needed to control the entire supply chain, from the coca fields in Peru and Bolivia to the noses of consumers in Miami and Los Angeles. This was the genesis of the Medellín Cartel, a business model so brutally efficient and profitable that it would, for a time, make him one of the richest and most powerful men in the world. He was no longer a tombstone thief from Envigado. He was a businessman, a trafficker, an emerging kingpin, and he was just getting started. The story of Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria does not begin with the roar of gunfire or the sleek hull of a cocaine-laden speedboat, but in the quiet, unassuming municipality of Rio Negro, Colombia, on the 1st of December, 1949. He was born into a family of modest means, the third of 7 children to Abel de Jesus Dari Escobar, a humble farmer, and Hermilda de los Dolores Gaviria Barrio, a dedicated school teacher. This contrast between his parents, the earthy, simple campesino, and the educated, aspirational teacher, would create a fascinating dynamic in young Pablo's life. Shortly after his birth, the family relocated to the city of Medellín, a place that would become both his kingdom and his battleground. They settled in the working-class neighborhood of Envigado, a district that, while not the absolute poorest, was far from the gleaming centers of power and wealth. It was here, in the dusty, winding streets of a city nestled in the Abura Valley, that the first seeds of his future empire were sown. From a very young age, Pablo exhibited a complex duality that would define his entire life. To his mother, he was a devoted son, affectionate and caring, harboring a deep-seated fear of poverty, or pobreza, a word that would become his lifelong motivator and greatest terror. He famously promised his mother that one day he would give her everything she desired, and that he would one day become president of Colombia. This ambition, fueled by a desperate desire to escape the confines of his social class, was the noble side of the coin. The other side was visible on the streets. As a teenager, Pablo was not just a mischievous boy. He was a budding entrepreneur with a blatant disregard for the law. He began his criminal career not with drugs, but with petty crimes. He would steal tombstones from the local cemetery, sanding off the inscriptions and reselling them to desperate families at a discount. A macabre and cynical business that displayed a chilling lack of empathy from the very start. He later graduated to stealing cars and selling counterfeit lottery tickets, demonstrating an early understanding of illicit markets and a willingness to exploit any opportunity, no matter how deceitful. It was during this time that he allegedly got his famous nickname, El Doctor, a moniker of respect that would later be uttered with fear across the continent. His first major foray into the drug trade was not with cocaine, but with marijuana. He began by acting as a small-time smuggler and enforcer, but his sharp mind quickly recognized the limitations of this trade. The real future, the astronomical profits, lay in a different, purer, and more potent substance, cocaine hydrochloride. The early 1970s saw the dawn of the cocaine boom in the United States, and Pablo Escobar, with his innate cunning, ruthless ambition, and a network of contacts he was rapidly building, was perfectly positioned to ride that wave. He started small, establishing rudimentary processing labs in the jungles of Colombia and Peru. But his vision was grand. He understood that to control the market, he needed to control the entire supply chain, from the coca fields in Peru and Bolivia to the noses of consumers in Miami and Los Angeles. This was the genesis of the Medellín Cartel, a business model so brutally efficient and profitable that it would, for a time, make him one of the richest and most powerful men in the world. He was no longer a tombstone thief from Envigado. He was a businessman, a trafficker, an emerging kingpin, and he was just getting started. The transition from a street-level hustler to the architect of a global narcotics empire required not just ambition, but a revolutionary vision, and Pablo Escobar possessed that in terrifying abundance. He looked at the fragmented, disorganized world of cocaine smuggling in the early 1970s and saw a blueprint for a vertically integrated multinational corporation, one that would, however, operate entirely in the shadows, governed by violence instead of law. His genius, a term used here devoid of any moral judgment, lay in his understanding of logistics, economics, and human corruption. The first pillar of his empire was the sourcing of the raw material, while Colombia would become the processing and export hub. The coca leaves themselves were primarily cultivated in the vast, ungovernable jungles of Peru and Bolivia. Escobar, along with his partners like the Alcoa brothers and José Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, established sophisticated networks to purchase these leaves in bulk, often using intimidation and force to coerce farmers into exclusive contracts, thereby ensuring a steady, controllable supply. The second pillar was the complex chemical process of transformation. He pioneered the establishment of massive, mobile cocaine processing laboratories hidden deep within the Colombian rainforest. These were not small-scale operations. They were industrial complexes, complete with airstrips, living quarters for chemists and armed guards. The process involved transporting the coca paste from the source countries, refining it into pure cocaine, hydrochloride in these jungle labs, and then preparing it for its journey north. This is where the third and most audacious pillar came into play, the transportation network, the very arteries of his empire. Escobar's cartel mastered every conceivable method of moving their product. They used small, nimble aircraft that could land on clandestine airstrips in the Colombian plains and then make daring, low-altitude flights to drop their cargo in the swamps of the Bahamas or the remote coasts of Florida. They purchased fishing trawlers and speedboats, stuffing false hulls with thousands of kilos of cocaine. They even innovated with mullahs, who would ingest condoms filled with the drug or hide it in elaborate compartments within their luggage. But the most iconic of all his methods was the mothership strategy, where large freighters would wait in international waters, acting as floating warehouses from which countless smaller, faster boats would ferry the drugs to the shore. A logistical nightmare for the underfunded and outgunned coast guards of the era. The final pillar, and perhaps the most crucial, was the distribution and money laundering apparatus within the United States. Escobar established cells in major cities like Miami, which was soon dubbed the capital of Latin America due to the flood of cocaine and the ensuing violence. These cells were run by trusted lieutenants who managed the wholesale distribution to street gangs, ensuring the product reached the end consumer. The billions of dollars in cash generated posed a new problem: how to get it back to Colombia. This was solved through a complex web of shell companies, front businesses like car dealerships and real estate agencies, and the simple, brazen physical smuggling of currency back into Colombia on the same planes and boats that had brought the drugs north. This entire operation, from leaf to nose and from dollar to peso, was managed with the ruthless efficiency of a Fortune 500 CEO. Escobar's word was law, and his philosophy, which would become the chilling mantra of his reign. Plata o plomo, meaning silver or lead, was the glue that held it all together. To any official, judge, policeman, or politician who stood in his way, he offered a simple, brutal choice: take a bribe, the silver, and become complicit, or refuse and face the lead of an assassin's bullet. This system of institutional corruption, built on a foundation of fear and greed, allowed his empire to grow at an exponential, unprecedented rate, flooding the United States with high purity cocaine and generating a revenue stream so vast it became a problem of physics and logistics in itself. A problem that would lead to one of the most bizarre and iconic images of his wealth: the transition from a street-level hustler to the architect of a global narcotics empire required not just ambition, but a revolutionary vision, and Pablo Escobar possessed that in terrifying abundance. He looked at the fragmented, disorganized world of cocaine smuggling in the early 1970s and saw a blueprint for a vertically integrated multinational corporation, one that would, however, operate entirely in the shadows, governed by violence instead of law. His genius, a term used here devoid of any moral judgment, lay in his understanding of logistics, economics, and human corruption. The first pillar of his empire was the sourcing of the raw material, while Colombia would become the processing and export hub. The coca leaves themselves were primarily cultivated in the vast, ungovernable jungles of Peru and Bolivia. Escobar, along with his partners like the Aqua brothers and Jose Gonzalo, Roddy Gezgacha, established sophisticated networks to purchase these leaves in bulk, often using intimidation and force to coerce farmers into exclusive contracts, thereby ensuring a steady, controllable supply. The second pillar was the complex chemical process of transformation. He pioneered the establishment of massive, mobile cocaine processing laboratories hidden deep within the Colombian rainforest. These were not small-scale operations. They were industrial complexes, complete with airstrips, living quarters for chemists and armed guards. The process involved transporting the coca paste from the source countries, refining it into pure cocaine hydrochloride in these jungle labs, and then preparing it for its journey north. This is where the third and most audacious pillar came into play, the transportation network, the very arteries of his empire. Escobar's cartel mastered every conceivable method of moving their product. They used small, nimble aircraft that could land on clandestine airstrips in the Colombian plains and then make daring, low-altitude flights to drop their cargo in the swamps of the Bahamas or the remote coasts of Florida. They purchased fishing trawlers and speedboats, stuffing false hulls with thousands of kilos of cocaine. They even innovated with mullahs, who would ingest condoms filled with the drug or hide it in elaborate compartments within their luggage. But the most iconic of all his methods was the mothership strategy, where large freighters would wait in international waters, acting as floating warehouses from which countless smaller, faster boats would ferry the drugs to the shore, a logistical nightmare for the underfunded and outgunned coast guards of the era. The final pillar, and perhaps the most crucial, was the distribution and money laundering apparatus within the United States. Escobar established cells in major cities like Miami, which was soon dubbed the capital of Latin America due to the flood of cocaine and the ensuing violence. These cells were run by trusted lieutenants who managed the wholesale distribution to street gangs, ensuring the product reached the end consumer. The billions of dollars in cash generated posed a new problem: how to get it back to Colombia. This was solved through a complex web of shell companies, front businesses like car dealerships and real estate agencies, and the simple, brazen physical smuggling of currency back into Colombia on the same planes and boats that had brought the drugs north. This entire operation, from leaf to nose and from dollar to peso, was managed with the ruthless efficiency of a Fortune 500 CEO. Escobar's word was law, and his philosophy, which would become the chilling mantra of his reign: plata o plomo, meaning silver or lead, was the glue that held it all together. To any official, judge, policeman, or politician who stood in his way, he offered a simple, brutal choice. Take a bribe, the silver, and become complicit, or refuse and face the lead of an assassin's bullet. This system of institutional corruption, built on a foundation of fear and greed, allowed his empire to grow at an exponential, unprecedented rate, flooding the United States with high-purity cocaine and generating a revenue stream so vast it became a problem of physics and logistics in itself. A problem that would lead to one of the most bizarre and iconic images of his wealth: the transition from a street-level hustler to the architect of a global narcotics empire required not just ambition, but a revolutionary vision, and Pablo Escobar possessed that in terrifying abundance. He looked at the fragmented, disorganized world of cocaine smuggling in the early 1970s and saw a blueprint for a vertically integrated multinational corporation, one that would, however, operate entirely in the shadows, governed by violence instead of law. His genius, a term used here devoid of any moral judgment, lay in his understanding of logistics, economics, and human corruption. The first pillar of his empire was the sourcing of the raw material, while Colombia would become the processing and export hub. The coca leaves themselves were primarily cultivated in the vast, ungovernable jungles of Peru and Bolivia. Escobar, along with his partners like the Aqua brothers and Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, established sophisticated networks to purchase these leaves in bulk, often using intimidation and force to coerce farmers into exclusive contracts, thereby ensuring a steady, controllable supply. The second pillar was the complex chemical process of transformation. He pioneered the establishment of massive, mobile cocaine processing laboratories hidden deep within the Colombian rainforest. These were not small-scale operations. They were industrial complexes, complete with airstrips, living quarters for chemists, and armed guards. The process involved transporting the coca paste from the source countries, refining it into pure cocaine, hydrochloride in these jungle labs, and then preparing it for its journey north. This is where the third and most audacious pillar came into play: the transportation network, the very arteries of his empire. Escobar's cartel mastered every conceivable method of moving their product. They used small, nimble aircraft that could land on clandestine airstrips in the Colombian plains, and then make daring, low-altitude flights to drop their cargo in the swamps of the Bahamas or the remote coasts of Florida. They purchased fishing trawlers and speedboats, stuffing false holes with thousands of kilos of cocaine. They even innovated with mullahs, who would ingest condoms filled with the drug or hide it in elaborate compartments within their luggage. But the most iconic of all his methods was the mothership strategy, where large freighters would wait in international waters, acting as floating warehouses from which countless smaller, faster boats would ferry the drugs to the shore. A logistical nightmare for the underfunded and outgunned coast guards of the era. The final pillar, and perhaps the most crucial, was the distribution and money laundering apparatus within the United States. Escobar established cells in major cities like Miami, which was soon dubbed the capital of Latin America due to the flood of cocaine and the ensuing violence. These cells were run by trusted lieutenants who managed the wholesale distribution to street gangs, ensuring the product reached the end consumer. The billions of dollars in cash generated posed a new problem: how to get it back to Colombia. This was solved through a complex web of shell companies, front businesses like car dealerships and real estate agencies, and the simple, brazen physical smuggling of currency back into Colombia on the same planes and boats that had brought the drugs north. This entire operation, from leaf to nose and from dollar to peso, was managed with the ruthless efficiency of a Fortune 500 CEO. Escobar's word was law, and his philosophy, which would become the chilling mantra of his reign: plata o plomo, meaning silver or lead, was the glue that held it all together. To any official, judge, policeman, or politician who stood in his way, he offered a simple, brutal choice: take a bribe, the silver, and become complicit, or refuse and face the lead of an assassin's bullet. This system of institutional corruption, built on a foundation of fear and greed, allowed his empire to grow at an exponential, unprecedented rate, flooding the United States with high-purity cocaine and generating a revenue stream so vast it became a problem of physics and logistics in itself. A problem that would lead to one of the most bizarre and iconic images of his wealth. The river of cash flowing back to Medellín was not merely a financial phenomenon. It was a deluge that transformed Pablo Escobar from a powerful criminal into a quasi-mythical figure, a modern-day Midas for whom every venture turned not to gold, but to pure, unadulterated power. The sheer volume of physical U.S. currency was so immense that it posed a logistical nightmare. It is estimated that at the height of his empire, the Medellín Cartel was smuggling well over $1 billion a week into Colombia. The cartel employed professional, money, counting, teams who worked in shifts around the clock, yet they still fell hopelessly behind. The solution was as crude as it was telling. They would simply store the bills in colossal warehouses, where they were stacked to the ceilings. It is here that the infamous legend was born that Escobar, losing nearly 10% of his cash annually to rats, moisture, and simple spoilage, would simply write off the loss as a cost of doing business. This unimaginable wealth demanded an outlet, and Escobar's spending was a spectacle of both grandiose ambition and the parvenu's lack of subtlety. His primary residence, the Hacienda Nena Poles, was a 7,000-acre estate that became the ultimate symbol of his success and his eccentricities. The entrance was guarded by a replica of the single engine Piper aircraft that had carried his first major cocaine shipment, a monument to his audacious beginnings. The estate itself was a sprawling fantasyland, complete with a private zoo stocked with giraffes, hippos, and elephants imported from Africa, life-size dinosaur statues, multiple swimming pools, and a fleet of luxury and vintage cars. It was a palace built for a king, and he opened its gates to the poor of the region, solidifying his image as a man of the people. But Enna Poles was just the beginning. He owned an entire apartment block, the Monaco building in Medellín, countless ranches, and a private fleet of aircraft, including a Learjet for his personal use. He invested heavily in legitimate businesses, from radio stations to construction firms, in a relentless, almost desperate pursuit of legitimacy. This desire to be seen not as a narco, but as a respectable statesman and benefactor, became a central, driving obsession. He launched a political career, getting himself elected as an alternate congressman in 1982, a position that granted him parliamentary immunity and a platform. He saw himself as a modern day Robin Hood, and to a significant portion of Medellin's impoverished population, he was exactly that. This was the other, carefully cultivated side of the Escobar coin, Pablo the philanthropist. He funded the construction of entire neighborhoods, like the poor district of Medellín that still bears his family name, Barrio Pablo Escobar. He built hundreds of houses for the destitute, constructed soccer fields, and handed out cash to the poor on the streets, earning their unwavering loyalty and the folkloric title, El Patron. He understood the power of narrative and public perception better than any politician. He would show up at public events surrounded by cheering crowds, a living embodiment of the dream that even the poorest kid from the slums could, through sheer force of will, rise to challenge the entrenched, elitist establishment of Bogotá, a class that had always looked down on Medellín and its Pesa people. This Robin Hood image, however, was a grotesque facade, a psychological balm for his own ego, and a strategic tool to build a human shield of popular support. The same man who handed out banknotes to widows was also the man who ordered the deaths of thousands without a second thought. The same wealth that built houses also funded a private army and a terror apparatus so savage it would soon plunge the entire nation into a state of civil war. A war that would be declared from the very halls of power he so desperately sought to join, triggered by an event that would shatter his carefully constructed illusion of legitimacy and set him on a path of all-out war against the Colombian state. The meticulously constructed edifice of Pablo Escobar's dual existence, balancing the ruthless Kingpin with the benevolent public figure, could not withstand the inherent contradictions forever. The tipping point arrived with the appointment of Rodrigo Lara Bonilla as Colombia's Minister of Justice in 1983. Lara Bonilla was a young, charismatic, and fiercely ambitious politician from the ruling Liberal Party, and he recognized the existential threat the burgeoning narcotics trade posed to the very fabric of the Colombian state. Unlike many of his contemporaries who were either cowed by fear or seduced by plata, Lara Bonilla chose plomo, and he chose it publicly and relentlessly. He made the destruction of the drug cartels, and Pablo Escobar in particular, his personal crusade. He used his position to launch a very public, very aggressive campaign, denouncing Escobar by name in the media and in Congress, stripping away the veil of legitimacy that Escobar had worked so hard to weave. The conflict escalated rapidly when Lara Bonilla initiated a massive crackdown, seizing assets, raiding laboratories, and most humiliatingly for Escobar, orchestrating the public destruction of his prized collection of exotic cars at the Hacienda and Pols. But the most significant blow was yet to come. Lara Bonilla, armed with intelligence and a deep-seated moral conviction, directly confronted Escobar's political status. He presented compelling evidence in Congress that Escobar's alternate congressman's seat was founded on a bedrock of fraud, intimidation, and drug money. The political and social elite of Bogotá, who had always viewed the upstart from Medellín with disdain and fear, seized this opportunity. Under immense pressure and public scrutiny, Escobar was formally expelled from Congress in January 1984. This was not just a political defeat, it was a profound and very public humiliation. It shattered his dream of becoming president, of being accepted into the hallowed halls of the establishment he both despised and craved to be a part of. The Robin Hood narrative was crumbling, revealing the hardened criminal beneath. For Escobar, this was an unforgivable act of war. Lara Bonilla had not only attacked his business, he had destroyed his dream, his identity, and his carefully crafted reputation. In the twisted logic of Escobar's world, such a transgression could only be met with ultimate, unequivocal force. The silver had been refused, only to remain. On the evening of April 30th, 1984, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla was being driven home in his white Mercedes Benz in the north of Bogotá. His security detail, a necessary precaution he was all too aware of, trailed him. As his car slowed in traffic, two assassins on a motorcycle drew alongside. One of them, a young gunman, raised a MAC-10 submachine gun and unleashed a torrent of bullets into the minister's car, killing him instantly. The assassination of a sitting minister of justice was an unprecedented act of audacity. It was not a covert killing, it was a public execution, a message sent to the highest echelons of the Colombian government. The message was simple and terrifying. No one was beyond the reach of Pablo Escobar's wrath. The nation was thrown into a state of shock and collective panic. The government of President Belisario Betancur, which had previously been hesitant, was now forced into a corner. The very sovereignty of the state had been challenged. Within hours, Betancur declared a state of siege and reinstated the extradition treaty with the United States, a legal instrument that had been dormant, but was the single greatest weapon in the anti-narcotics arsenal and the one thing Escobar and his fellow narcos feared above all else. Extradition meant being tried in a U.S. court, far from the corrupting influence of their wealth and intimidation, in a system where Plato Plomo held no power. It meant dying in a cold, lonely American prison cell. For Escobar, this was a declaration of total war, and he accepted it in kind. The murder of Rodrigo Lara Bonilla was the moment the mask finally and irrevocably fell. The philanthropist, the builder of homes, the man of the people, was gone. In his place stood a warlord, a terrorist who had declared war on the Colombian state itself. The era of uneasy coexistence was over. The next decade would be a descent into an abyss of fire and blood, a period known simply as La Violencia Narco, where car bombs would rip through city streets. Judges and journalists would be slaughtered by the hundreds, and the hunt for Pablo Escobar would become the defining mission of the Colombian nation. The reinstatement of the extradition treaty was a clarion call that transformed Pablo Escobar's criminal enterprise into a full-fledged insurgency. A terrorist organization with the singular, stated goal of forcing the Colombian government to bend to its will. The war was no longer just about protecting a drug empire. It was a battle for the very soul and legal framework of the nation, fought under the banner, "Well, we prefer a grave in Colombia to a jail cell in the United States." This mantra became the rallying cry for the Medellín Cartel, a sentiment that resonated with other traffickers and was used to justify an unprecedented campaign of violence designed to terrorize the Colombian establishment into submission. Escobar's strategy was multifaceted and brutally simple to make the cost of enforcing the law so high, so bloody, and so terrifying that the state would have no choice but to negotiate. The first and most visible front in this war was the systematic annihilation of the Colombian justice system. He declared war on judges, prosecutors, and any law enforcement official who dared to pursue him. A dedicated squad of teenage assassins, known as sicarios, often recruited from the very neighborhoods Escobar had built, became the instruments of this judicial massacre. They operated on motorcycles, their faces obscured by helmets, their Mach 10 submachine guns spitting fire with chilling efficiency. They would hunt their targets in broad daylight, on their way to work, outside their homes, in restaurants, sending a message that nowhere was safe. The impact was catastrophic. Hundreds of judges and court officials were murdered. Many resigned in terror. Those who remained worked under the constant shadow of death, their identities hidden, their lives a nomadic existence to avoid the cartel's reach. The judiciary, the bedrock of any civilized society, was being systematically dismantled through pure, unadulterated terror. But Escobar's war was not confined to the halls of justice. He understood the power of the media and sought to control the narrative through the same tactics. Journalists who investigated his empire or criticized his methods were added to his growing hit lists. The editor of the country's leading newspaper, El Espectador, was assassinated, and the newspaper's offices were bombed repeatedly. The message to the Fourth Estate was as clear as it was to the judiciary: silence or death. However, the most shocking escalation, the act that truly marked a descent into a new realm of barbarism, was the turn towards indiscriminate, mass casualty terrorism. The preferred instrument of this new strategy was the car bomb. These were not targeted assassinations, they were acts of sheer, demonstrative terror designed to shatter the public's sense of security and prove the state's impotence. The first major atrocity of this kind was the bombing of the Avianca Flight Tudor 3 in November 1989, a plot intended to kill a presidential candidate, Cesar Gaviria, who had managed to switch flights at the last minute. The bomb, planted on the aircraft, detonated in mid-air, killing all 107 people on board. It was an act of mass murder that showed a complete disregard for human life. But the single most iconic and devastating act of this terror campaign was yet to come. It would target the very symbol of Colombian state intelligence and its fight against the cartels, the DAS building in Bogotá. This war was no longer a shadowy conflict between cops and robbers. It was a scorched earth policy being enacted on the streets of Colombia's greatest cities. A symphony of destruction orchestrated by a man who had calculated that he could murder his way to a negotiated peace, a belief that would lead to one of the most audacious and destructive bombings in the history of the hemisphere. The campaign of terror reached its horrifying crescendo on the morning of December 6, 1989. An act of such brazen audacity and destructive power that it would be seared into the collective memory of the nation as the day Pablo Escobar brought the war to the very heart of the state's security apparatus. The target was the Department of Administrative Security, the DEAS, Colombia's equivalent of the FBI, the lead agency in the investigation against him. Its headquarters, a multi-story building on Avenida El Dorado in the heart of Bogotá, was a symbol of the government's resolve, a fortress from which the hunt was coordinated. Escobar's plan was not to intimidate this institution. It was to annihilate it physically and psychologically. The instrument of this annihilation was a bomb of staggering proportions, concealed within a truck that was parked directly in front of the DEAS building. The vehicle contained an estimated 500 kilograms of dynamite, a payload designed for maximum devastation. At 7:30 a.m., as the city was bustling with the morning rush hour and the DEAS building was filling with employees, agents, and, tragically, visitors including children in a daycare center, the bomb was detonated by remote control. The resulting explosion was cataclysmic. It was not merely a loud noise. It was a physical force that ripped through the city block. The entire front of the DEAS building was sheared off, collapsing into a mountain of rubble, dust, and twisted rebar. The shockwave shattered windows over a kilometer away, and the sound of the blast echoed across the capital, a single, deafening declaration of war. The immediate aftermath was a scene from a battlefield. Dozens of cars were incinerated, their husks littering the street. Bodies and parts of bodies were scattered amidst the debris. First responders, themselves in a state of shock, clawed at the concrete with their bare hands, trying to reach the screams trapped inside. The final death toll reached 63 people, with more than 1,000 injured. The victims were not just police and intelligence agents, they were secretaries, janitors, drivers, and civilians who happened to be passing by. Among the dead were children from the building's daycare, a detail that added a new layer of monstrous cruelty to Escobar's already blood-soaked legacy. The DEAS bombing was a strategic masterpiece of terror. It demonstrated, in the most graphic terms possible, that no institution was safe, that the state could not protect its most vital organs, let alone its citizens. It was a message aimed directly at the incoming administration of President Cesar Gaviria, who was due to take office in a few months. This is the price of pursuing me. The bombing succeeded in crippling the DEAS, destroying vast archives of evidence, and killing some of the most knowledgeable agents on the Escobar case. It plunged the nation into a profound state of fear and mourning. But it also had a second, unintended consequence. It galvanized a faction of the state that had been operating in the shadows, but would now be unleashed with a new singular focus. The bombing convinced the Colombian government that traditional methods of law enforcement were useless against an enemy who waged war with car bombs. It led to the creation of a special, elite joint task force, drawing from the best of the police and military intelligence, and, most significantly, it forced the state to officially and openly collaborate with a rival entity that had its own, very personal vendetta against Pablo Escobar. This entity was a group known as Los Pepes, perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, or those persecuted by Pablo Escobar, a vigilante organization comprised of former Medellín Cartel associates, rivals from the Cali Cartel, and the families of Escobar's countless victims. The state, in its desperation, would turn a blind eye to their methods, creating a deadly and unofficial alliance that would hunt Escobar with a brutality that mirrored his own, marking the beginning of the endgame, where the hunter would become the hunted in a far more personal and vengeful war. The Diaz bombing, while a terrifying demonstration of power, proved to be a profound strategic miscalculation for Pablo Escobar. It did not, as he had hoped, break the will of the Colombian state. Instead, it shattered the last vestiges of restraint and forged a new, far more dangerous enemy, one that operated outside the bounds of law and morality, an entity born from the very darkness he had sown. This enemy was Los Pepes, Los Perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, those persecuted by Pablo Escobar. This was not a state organization. It was a shadowy vigilante alliance comprised of a powerful and volatile coalition of his most bitter enemies. Its ranks included former Medellín Cartel associates whom Escobar had betrayed or tried to kill. Most notably the Galeano and Moncada brothers, whose murders he had ordered, rivals from the burgeoning Cali Cartel, who saw a strategic opportunity to eliminate their most formidable competitor, and perhaps most dangerously, wealthy landowners and families whose loved ones had been killed or kidnapped by Escobar. Men like Don Berna and Fidel Castallo, who were driven not by business rivalry, but by a deep, personal thirst for vengeance. Los Pepes emerged from the shadows in early 1993, and their war was not fought with legal warrants and courtroom procedures. It was a war of annihilation, a scorched earth campaign designed to systematically dismantle everything Escobar had built, both his criminal empire and his personal life. Their tactics were a dark mirror of his own. They began by targeting the economic foundation of his power. They located and bombed his cocaine processing laboratories, his storage facilities, and his fleets of vehicles and aircraft. They identified and assassinated his key lieutenants, the accountants, lawyers, and logistics experts who kept the vast machine running, creating a climate of paranoia and betrayal within the cartel where no one felt safe. But their most psychologically devastating blows were against his personal property and his public legacy. They firebombed his family's residences, including the symbolic Hacienda Ana Poles, destroying his prized zoo and reducing his palace to a smoldering ruin. They bombed the offices of his newspaper, Medellín Civica, which he used for propaganda. The message of Los Pepes was clear For every bomb you plant, we will plant 2. For every associate you kill, we will kill 10 of yours. We will erase you from the earth and from memory. The Colombian government, particularly the newly formed search bloc, an elite police unit dedicated solely to hunting Escobar, found itself in a morally and legally ambiguous position. While officially denying any connection, it became an open secret that the search bloc and Los Pepes were engaged in a de facto and highly effective collaboration. The search bloc, led by Colonel Hugo Martinez, would conduct official raids and investigations, while Los Pepes, with their intimate knowledge of the cartel's inner workings and their willingness to use unrestrained brutality, would provide intelligence, carry out extrajudicial killings, and terrorize Escobar's support network. This unofficial alliance created a pincer movement that began to tighten around the fugitive Kingpin with relentless pressure. The constant attacks by Los Pepes crippled his ability to generate revenue and manage his empire, forcing him to become more mobile, more isolated, and more paranoid than ever before. The comfortable hideouts and secure communication lines he once relied on were systematically destroyed. He was being hunted not just by the state, but by a phantom that knew his methods, his secrets, and his weaknesses. This period marked a crucial shift in the dynamics of power. The man who had once held the nation hostage was now himself a cornered animal, his empire crumbling around him, his wealth becoming a liability, and his list of allies shrinking by the day. The reign of the ruthless emperor was faltering, not under the weight of a traditional army, but under the relentless, vengeful assault of the very monsters he had created, setting the stage for a final, desperate act that would see him confined to a prison of his own design, a bizarre and luxurious compound that would become the next theater in this escalating endgame. The relentless, 2. Front war waged by the official state and the unofficial shadow army of Los Pepes began to exact a crippling toll on Pablo Escobar, not just on his empire, but on his psyche and his cherished family. By the middle of 1991, he was a fugitive in his own city, constantly on the move, his support network eroded by betrayal and assassination, his properties in ruins. The pressure was immense and unyielding. It was in this context of strategic desperation and personal fear for his family's safety that he conceived one of the most audacious and bizarre chapters of his entire criminal career, a negotiated surrender, but on his own uniquely extravagant terms. He entered into complex negotiations with the government of President Cesar Gaviria, which was itself desperate to end the carnage and see Escobar behind bars. The resulting agreement was a testament to Escobar's remaining power and the state's weakened position. He would surrender to authorities, but only under a set of non-negotiable conditions. The most critical of these was the absolute, constitutional prohibition of his extradition to the United States. This was his primary goal, the very reason he had gone to war, and he achieved it. In a stunning political move, a new constitution was ratified in July 1991, which included a clause banning the extradition of Colombian nationals. With this legal guarantee in place, Escobar's second condition was the nature of his imprisonment. He would not be sent to a standard high security prison. He would be incarcerated in a custom-built facility, designed by him, located on a mountainside overlooking his hometown of Medellín. This place would become known as La Catedral, the cathedral. It was unlike any prison on earth. Perched at an altitude of 8,000 feet, the complex was more a fortified luxury resort than a penitentiary. It featured a giant dollhouse for his daughter, a fully stocked bar, a jacuzzi, a soccer field, a discotheque, and spectacular views of the Abura Valley. His family and mistresses could visit freely, and he could host parties and business meetings without interference. The regular Colombian prison guards were not allowed inside the main gates. Security was provided by his own personally selected men, who were, in effect, his loyal sicarios. The Colombian government's rationale for accepting these humiliating terms was a hope for peace, a belief that containing Escobar was preferable to the endless bloodshed of hunting him. On June 19, 1991, Pablo Escobar formally surrendered, walking into La Catedral as if he were a visiting dignitary, not a convicted criminal. For the next year, he ruled his empire from this gilded cage. He managed his remaining drug operations via fax and phone, ordered the murders of rivals and perceived traitors, and lived a life of opulent leisure while technically serving a sentence. However, this arrangement was inherently unstable and could not last. The spectacle of La Catedral became a national embarrassment for the Gaviria administration and a source of fury for his enemies, particularly the Cali cartel and Los Pepes, who saw it not as a prison, but as a command and control center. The tipping point came in July 1992, when Escobar committed a fatal error by ordering the torture and murder of two of his own cartel associates, Fernando Galano and Gerardo Moncada, inside La Catedral itself. He suspected them of hiding money from him, and his punishment was swift and brutal. This act was too brazen, even for a government willing to tolerate his luxuries. The families of the murdered men went public, and the government, facing a massive scandal, decided it had to act. President Gaviria authorized a plan to transfer Escobar to a standard, military-run prison. But Escobar, with his sophisticated intelligence network inside the army and police, was warned of the impending transfer. He knew that leaving La Catedral would make him vulnerable, not just to the state, but to his many enemies who waited outside. On July 27, 1992, as a government delegation approached the prison to enact the transfer, Escobar and his men simply walked out. There was no dramatic shootout. They exploited the complex's layout and the state's hesitation, vanishing back into the sprawling slums of Medellín. His surrender was over. The gilded cage was empty. He was, once again, a fugitive, but this time he was weaker, more isolated, and the forces arrayed against him were more determined, more unified, and armed with a weapon he could not bribe or intimidate, a revolutionary new technology that would track his every move. The walkout from La Catedral marked the beginning of the end for Pablo Escobar, a frantic and paranoid 16-month coda to a life of unparalleled criminal dominion. He was now a fugitive in the most profound sense. But the world had dramatically changed since his last period on the run. The comfortable safe houses and reliable networks of old were largely gone, dismantled by Los Pepes and compromised by the now relentless search block. His empire was in shambles. His wealth was increasingly inaccessible, and his list of trusted allies had dwindled to a desperate few, primarily his personal bodyguard, Limon, and a handful of loyalists. He could no longer rule from a palace or a mountaintop prison. His kingdom had shrunk to a few square miles in the Comuna 13 and Los Olivos neighborhoods of Medellín, the very slums that had once been his stronghold and human shield. He moved constantly between a series of modest, pre-arranged safe houses, often staying only a few days before the fear of betrayal would force him to move again. His existence was a claustrophobic cycle of hiding, communicating through a fragile web of messengers, and managing the remnants of his operations, all while the noose tightened inexorably around him. The psychological toll was immense. The man who had once dined with presidents and built his own zoo was now confined to small, dark apartments, his only luxuries being cheap junk food and the constant companionship of a portable radio, which he used to monitor the police bands and the news, perpetually listening for the sounds of his own impending capture. His paranoia, always a feature of his personality, now became his defining characteristic. He trusted no one completely, suspecting even his closest associates of plotting against him. This isolation was a strategic victory for his enemies, who were now operating with unprecedented coordination and technological advantage. The search block, under the unwavering leadership of Colonel Hugo Martinez, had been reorganized and was now receiving direct, game-changing assistance from the United States. The key technological breakthrough was the top secret ability to track his communications in near real time. U.S. intelligence agencies, primarily the CIA and the National Security Agency, provided the Colombians with sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment and, crucially, the training to use it. They focused their efforts on locating the one lifeline Escobar could not afford to sever: his connection to his family. He was a deeply devoted, if twisted, family man, and his need to speak with his wife, Maria Victoria, and his two children, Manuela and Juan Pablo, was his most exploitable vulnerability. The family, for their own safety, had fled to Germany, but Escobar risked everything to call them. The American and Colombian intelligence agencies set up a massive surveillance operation, tapping phone lines and using direction, finding technology to triangulate the signals from the mobile phones he used for these calls. Each call, no matter how brief, was a potential death sentence, giving the hunters a fleeting electronic footprint of their prey. The search block, now a highly disciplined and motivated force, would scramble with each intercepted signal, raiding buildings and sweeping neighborhoods, each time getting a little closer, learning his patterns, and shrinking his world further. This high-tech manhunt was complemented by the brutal, on-the-ground intelligence provided by Los Pepes, who had now been largely absorbed into a formal paramilitary structure. They acted as the eyes and ears, using their intimate knowledge of the Medellín underworld to identify safe houses and intimidate anyone who might consider harboring him. The collaboration between the official state and the vengeful vigilantes, though morally fraught, created an inescapable net. Escobar was being squeezed from all sides by technology from the sky, by soldiers on the ground, and by betrayal from within his own crumbling organization. He was a ghost haunting his own city, a king without a kingdom, his every move tracked, his every conversation monitored, his world collapsing inward, until only one final, desperate phone call remained, a call that would pinpoint his location not in a fortified compound or a jungle hideout, but in a simple, middle-class house in a neighborhood called Los Olivos, setting the stage for the final, violent confrontation on a rooftop under the blazing Medellín sun. The end, when it finally came, was not a prolonged siege, but a swift, violent execution of a meticulously planned military operation. The culmination of 16 months of relentless technological pursuit and human intelligence. The final act began on the afternoon of December 2, 1993, a day that marked both the day after his 44th birthday and the end of his reign. Pablo Escobar was hiding in a safe house, a modest, two-story brick home in the Los Olivos neighborhood of Medellín, a location chosen for its anonymity amidst a community of teachers and middle-class families. He was there with his sole remaining bodyguard, Alvaro de Jesus Agudelo, known as Limon. The crucial break for the search block came, as anticipated, from his need to speak with his son. At approximately 1:30 p.m., Juan Pablo Escobar, then 16 years old, called his father from a hotel in Bogotá. It was a brief call, but it was all the electronic surveillance team, operating from a nearby van, needed. They locked onto the signal of the mobile phone Escobar was using, confirming his presence in a specific cluster of houses. The order was given immediately. A team of 17 highly trained operators from the search block, known as Delta Force, moved in swiftly and silently, cordoning off the area. They were not a conventional police unit. They were a military-style assault group armed with M16 rifles, grenades, and clad in black combat gear. Their intelligence was so precise that they knew exactly which house to target. At around 3:15 p.m., they stormed the property. The assault was sudden and overwhelming. Limon, caught by surprise on the second floor, was killed instantly in a hail of gunfire. Escobar, who had been on the phone, heard the commotion and made a desperate, fatal decision. Instead of surrendering, he grabbed his cherished 9mm pistol and attempted to flee across the red, tiled roof of the adjoining house. A desperate bid to reach the adjacent alleyway, where he might have had a chance to vanish once more into the labyrinthine streets. But there was no escape. The rooftop was a death trap. 2 soldiers assigned to flank the building were positioned on a neighboring roof. As Escobar, overweight and out of shape from months in hiding, scrambled across the tiles, he was spotted. The official account, maintained by the Colombian government, states that a fierce firefight ensued and Escobar was shot and killed in the exchange. However, the forensic evidence and the accounts of many investigators and journalists tell a more targeted story. The fatal shots were precise and devastating. One bullet entered behind his right ear, and another struck him in the hip. The trajectory of the head wound was almost certainly not from a soldier firing from a lower position. It was an execution-style shot, delivered at close range. The scene on the rooftop, once the shooting stopped, was one of grim finality. Pablo Escobar lay dead on the tiles, dressed in blue jeans and a red flannel shirt, his pistol lying nearby. The news of his death spread through Medellín and the world with the speed of a shockwave. The government announced it triumphantly as a victory for the state, a restoration of order. In the streets of Medellín, the reaction was deeply divided. In the wealthy neighborhoods, there was celebration and relief, the end of a long nightmare. But in the poor barrios he had built, in the slums that had been his sanctuary, there was an outpouring of genuine grief. Thousands of mourners poured into the streets, chanting his name, viewing him not as a monster, but as their fallen patron, their Robin Hood. His body was taken to a makeshift morgue, where a single, iconic photograph was taken, his head tilted back, a trickle of blood from his ear, the defiant mustache still prominent on his lifeless face. It was an image that sealed his legend, a visual full stop to a life of extreme violence and extreme ambition. The ruthless emperor was dead. The king of cocaine had fallen. The war was over. But his death did not end the drug trade. It simply created a vacuum that other cartels rushed to fill. It did not end the violence. It merely changed its shape. The legacy of Pablo Escobar was not peace, but a permanent scar on the soul of Colombia, a cautionary tale of how ambition, when utterly divorced from morality, can unleash a darkness so profound it can, for a time, hold the light of an entire nation hostage. A darkness whose echoes would reverberate long after the last shot was fired on that Medellín rooftop. The death of Pablo Escobar on that Medellín rooftop did not bring the clean, decisive conclusion that the Colombian government and its international allies had perhaps naively hoped for. Instead, it created a seismic power vacuum in the global cocaine trade, triggering a violent and chaotic realignment of the criminal underworld that would have profound and lasting consequences. With the Medellín Cartel effectively decapitated, its terrified and decimated remnants were swiftly absorbed or annihilated by their rivals, the more methodical and businesslike Cali Cartel. For a brief period, the Cali lords, the Rodriguez Orjuela brothers and Gilberto Rodriguez, became the new kings of cocaine, operating with a lower profile but with no less ambition until their own eventual downfall a few years later. The violence did not cease. It evolved, morphing from Escobar's theatrical terrorism into a more decentralized, fragmented conflict between smaller, numerous cartels and paramilitary groups fighting for control of trafficking routes, a conflict that continues to plague parts of Colombia to this day. The other immediate and starkly visible consequence of his death was the fate of his family, who were left utterly exposed and adrift in a world that either reviled them or sought to exploit them. His wife, Maria Victoria Henao, and his two children, 16-year-old Juan Pablo and 9-year-old Manuela, were in Germany at the time of his death, having fled there in a desperate attempt to find safety. Upon hearing the news, they became prisoners of their own notoriety. Germany, unwilling to host the family of the world's most infamous criminal, swiftly deported them. They found no welcome elsewhere in Europe and eventually returned to a hostile Colombia, where they faced not only public scorn, but also the very real and persistent threat of vengeance from the families of Escobar's victims and his former enemies. They were pariahs carrying a name that was a curse. Juan Pablo, who would later change his name to Sebastian Marroquin in a symbolic attempt to escape his father's shadow, has spoken extensively about the profound trauma of those years, the constant fear, the death threats, the crushing weight of his father's legacy, and the struggle to reconcile the loving father he knew with the mass murderer the world saw. He has spent his life in Argentina, living under his new identity, and has made a conscious effort to atone for his father's sins, meeting with the sons of some of his father's most prominent victims, including the sons of Luis Carlos Galán and Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, in a series of extraordinary and emotionally charged encounters, offering personal apologies for the pain his father caused. Manuela Escobar, just a child when her father died, has lived an intensely private life, shielded from the public eye, her existence a silent testament to the personal wreckage left behind by her father's empire. Maria Victoria, too, has remained largely out of the public sphere, her life a long journey from the opulent parties of Hacienda Ena Poles to a quiet, anonymous existence in exile. The story of the Escobar family after his death is a poignant and tragic coda, a narrative of survival, shame, and the endless struggle to escape the long, dark shadow cast by a man whose love for them was as genuine as his hatred for his enemies was lethal. They became the unintended, permanent victims of his ambition, living proof that the vast fortune and temporary power he accumulated ultimately came at a price that extended far beyond his own death, a price paid in the currency of a lifetime of hiding, fear, and the relentless burden of a name synonymous with evil. The legacy of Pablo Escobar is not a monolithic tombstone of infamy, but a fractured prism, reflecting starkly different realities depending on the angle of perception, a duality that remains as potent today as it was during his lifetime. To the outside world, to the governments of Colombia and the United States, to the families of his thousands of victims, and to the pages of mainstream history, he is the archetypal narcoterrorist, a symbol of unbridled evil, a man who pioneered the use of car bombs and the systematic murder of public officials, plunging a nation into a state of civil war for his own personal gain. His name is a byword for ruthless criminality, a cautionary tale of the destructive power of the drug trade and the corruption it breeds. This is the legacy documented in court records, memorialized in the graves of judges, police officers, and innocent bystanders, and seared into the national consciousness of Colombia as a period of profound national shame and trauma. Yet, to walk through the poor barrios of Medellín, to speak with the generations who lived through his reign, is to encounter a vastly different, deeply unsettling narrative. In these communities, the name Pablo Escobar often evokes a sense of nostalgia, even reverence. He is remembered not as El Patron, the violent drug lord, but as El Doctor, the benevolent benefactor. This folk hero status, baffling to outsiders, is rooted in the tangible, life-altering generosity he displayed. In a country with a long history of economic inequality and a central government often perceived as distant, corrupt, and neglectful, Escobar presented himself as the solution. He did not just hand out cash. He built infrastructure. He constructed entire neighborhoods, providing houses for the homeless, something the state had failed to do for decades. He paved roads, installed electricity, and built community soccer fields. He established social programs and handed out gifts during Christmas. For the impoverished masses, he was a tangible force for good, a man who saw their suffering and acted, while the politicians in Bogota merely made empty promises. This created a powerful bond, a debt of gratitude that, for many, has outweighed the abstract horrors of his violence, which often felt distant from their daily lives. This enduring dichotomy is the core of the Escobar enigma. He was a man capable of ordering the murder of hundreds in a single bombing and then weeping at the sight of a poor child in his neighborhood, ensuring the family received a new home. He was a psychopath with a profound, almost pathological need to be loved and admired. This calculated philanthropy was his armor and his weapon, a strategic investment in a human shield that protected him for years. The people of the comunas did not report his movements to the authorities, not only out of fear, but out of a genuine, albeit misguided, sense of loyalty. This legacy continues to manifest in modern Medellín in disturbing ways. The city has undergone a remarkable transformation, becoming a hub of innovation and tourism. Yet Escobar tourism persists. Guided tours take curious foreigners to the ruins of Hacienda Pols, the Monaco building and his grave, commodifying his violence, and critics argue, glorifying his memory. While many Colombians find this deeply offensive, it underscores a global fascination with the myth of the outlaw, the powerful rebel who challenged the system. The debate over his legacy is a microcosm of larger societal issues. The failure of the state to provide for its poorest citizens, the seductive power of the outlaw archetype, and the complex ways in which communities remember trauma. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth that evil is rarely monolithic, and that those who commit the most horrific acts can also be capable of gestures of profound, if selective, kindness. The story of Pablo Escobar is not a simple morality tale of good versus evil. It is a murkier, more troubling story about the nature of power, the psychology of violence, and the desperate conditions that can lead a society to embrace a monster as its savior. A legacy that continues to be contested and negotiated on the streets of Medellín and in the global imagination, a ghost that refuses to be laid to rest. The story of Pablo Escobar did not end with his death on a Medellín rooftop. It underwent a metamorphosis, escaping the confines of historical record and judicial, and to become a global cultural commodity. a mythologized narrative endlessly repackaged and consumed by a world both horrified and fascinated by the extremes he represented. This transformation of a brutal narco-terrorist into a pop culture anti-hero is one of the most complex and controversial aspects of his enduring legacy. A process largely driven by the relentless engine of international media. The most significant and influential catalyst in this process was undoubtedly the 2015 Netflix series Narcos, a slick, cinematic production that brought the Escobar saga to a global audience of millions. With Brazilian actor Wagner Moura delivering a charismatic and psychologically nuanced performance, the series presented a compelling, if dramatized, version of Escobar's rise and fall. While the show made efforts to depict his violence, it also inevitably humanized him, spending significant screen time on his family life, his insecurities, and his cunning intelligence. This duality, which was the core of his real life complexity, made for gripping television, but also risked blurring the lines between historical account and entertainment, between a murderous criminal and a captivating protagonist. Narcos was not an isolated phenomenon. It was part of a long-standing global fascination. It was preceded by countless documentaries, books, and news specials, and followed by a wave of similar content, including the Colombian series El Patron del Mal, which offered a more local perspective. This media saturation has created a peculiar dissonance. For many around the world, their primary, and often only, understanding of Pablo Escobar is filtered through the lens of these dramatic portrayals. The man becomes a character, his atrocities softened by narrative arcs and charismatic acting, his story slotted into the familiar trope of the rise and fall crime epic, alongside figures like Tony Soprano or Scarface. This commodification extends beyond screens and into the very streets where his crimes occurred. Narcotourism has become a thriving industry in Medellín. Tourists from across the globe pay for guided tours that visit the sites of his reign. The rooftop where he died, the bombed-out shell of the Monaco building, his grave in the Monte Sacro cemetery. This industry is a source of deep contention within Colombia. For the operators and some in the community, it is a legitimate form of historical tourism and an economic opportunity. For many others, particularly the victims' families, it is a deeply disrespectful monetization of their trauma, a grotesque spectacle that turns their pain into a photo opportunity. The global fascination raises a difficult question. What are we consuming when we consume the story of Pablo Escobar? Is it a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the drug trade's violence? Or is it a vicarious thrill, a safe exploration of a life lived at the absolute extremes of power and lawlessness? The answer is likely a combination of both. The myth of Escobar taps into a universal fascination with outlaws who defy the system, with self-made men who rise from nothing to challenge the established order, even if their methods are abhorrent. His story contains classic elements of tragedy hubris, a fatal flaw, and an inevitable downfall. This cultural repackaging, however, carries a significant cost. It risks erasing the visceral reality of the suffering he inflicted. The car bomb that ripped through the Diaz building, killing over 60 people, becomes a plot point. The murdered judges and journalists become faceless statistics in a television script. The real, ongoing pain of the victims is often lost in the glamour of the narrative. The global phenomenon of Pablo Escobar is therefore a story about storytelling itself, about who controls a narrative, how it is shaped for consumption, and the ethical responsibilities that come with turning real life horror into mass entertainment. It demonstrates that a legacy is not fixed by history books alone, but is continuously rewritten by the powerful and often problematic forces of popular culture, ensuring that the ghost of Pablo Escobar continues to haunt not just Colombia, but the world's imagination. His story forever suspended between the man he was and the myth he has become. To understand Pablo Escobar is to venture into the labyrinth of a profoundly complex and contradictory psyche, a mind where grandiosity and profound insecurity coexisted, where a seemingly genuine capacity for love and loyalty was seamlessly compartmentalized from an utter absence of empathy for his victims. He was not a simple, one-dimensional thug. He was a psychological phenomenon whose actions force us to confront difficult questions about the very nature of power, morality, and the circumstances that can create a figure of such monumental evil. Psychologists and criminologists who have studied his life often point to a tapestry of personality disorders that, when combined with his environment and ambition, created a perfect storm. He exhibited classic traits of narcissistic personality disorder on a historic scale, an insatiable need for admiration, a fantastical sense of self-importance, where he genuinely believed he was destined to be the president of Colombia, a profound lack of empathy for those outside his immediate circle, and a rage that was volcanic when his ego was challenged, as seen in the aftermath of his expulsion from Congress. This was intertwined with clear antisocial tendencies, a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others, deceitfulness, impulsivity, and a complete absence of remorse. Yet, these clinical terms feel insufficient to explain the Escobar enigma. What makes him so fascinating and terrifying is the duality, the ability to hold two diametrically opposed realities in his mind simultaneously. He could order the murder of a child in a random act of terrorism to send a political message, and then, hours later, be a doting, playful father to his own daughter, with both emotions being entirely authentic in the moment. This was not hypocrisy in the conventional sense. It was a form of radical compartmentalization that allowed him to bifurcate his moral universe into us and them. His family, his immediate associates, and the poor of Medellín who adored him were in those category worthy of love, protection, and generosity. Everyone else, politicians, police, judges, rivals, innocent bystanders, were them, abstract figures in a chess game, their lives meaningless in the pursuit of his goals. This mindset was encapsulated in his chillingly pragmatic philosophy of plata o plomo. It was not merely a tactic of intimidation. It was a reflection of his worldview. He believed every man had a price, and if that price was not money, then it was fear. He could not comprehend a value system based on duty, integrity, or the rule of law. This reduction of all human interaction to a transaction of silver or lead stripped away any notion of the sanctity of human life, reducing it to a variable in a cost-benefit analysis. His rise was also a stark lesson in the corrupting nature of absolute power. The initial ambition to escape poverty morphed into a lust for power for its own sake. The billions of dollars were not just a means to live well, they were a scorecard, a validation of his worth. He famously offered to pay off Colombia's entire national debt, an act of staggering audacity that demonstrated his view of the state not as a sovereign entity, but as a rival business that could be bought or bankrupted. This unchecked power eroded whatever fragile barriers remained between his ambition and his actions. With no external force capable of restraining him, his impulses became law, his paranoia became policy, and his violence escalated in a feedback loop of his own creation. He became a slave to the very empire he built, constantly needing more violence to protect his wealth and more wealth to fund his violence. The philosophical questions his life raises are unsettling. Was he a monster born or made? Was he a product of a specific set of circumstances? A corrupt state, systemic poverty, the golden opportunity of the cocaine boom? Or would his pathological traits have manifested in some other destructive way, regardless of his environment? There are no easy answers. He was likely a confluence of both, a personality predisposed to narcissism and a lack of empathy, placed in a fertile environment where those traits could not only flourish, but be rewarded with unprecedented power and wealth. His story is a dark mirror held up to society, reflecting the failures of institutions, the allure of the outlaw, and the terrifying speed at which a man can descend into barbarism when he operates beyond the pale of any moral or legal constraint. Pablo Escobar was not an alien creature. He was a human being who represents the ultimate potential for evil that resides within the pursuit of power without conscience. A cautionary tale written not in ink, but in blood and cocaine. Pablo Escobar's legacy is not confined to the sheer scale of his violence or the mythologizing of his persona. It is also profoundly embedded in the realm of criminal methodology, where he functioned as a dark innovator, a visionary who revolutionized the logistics, economics, and militarization of transnational crime. His approach was not that of a traditional gangster, but of a ruthless CEO of a black market multinational corporation, and the systems he pioneered forced a permanent evolution in global law enforcement and criminal enterprise alike. His most fundamental innovation was the concept of vertical integration within the drug trade. Before Escobar, cocaine trafficking was a fragmented affair, with various groups controlling disjointed segments of the supply chain. He saw the inefficiency in this model and seized control of the entire process, from the purchase of coca paste in Peru and Bolivia to the refining in sophisticated jungle laboratories, the transportation via a multi-faceted fleet of aircraft, boats, and submarines, and the wholesale distribution within the United States. This end-to-end control allowed for unprecedented economies of scale, quality control, and insulation from interdiction, a business model that would become the gold standard for every major cartel that followed. The logistical challenges of moving thousands of kilos of product and billions of dollars in cash required equally innovative solutions. He mastered the use of small, private aircraft for smuggling, developing complex routes and using clandestine airstrips carved out of the remote Colombian plains. He pioneered the mothership method, where large ocean-going vessels would loiter in international waters, acting as floating warehouses from which swarms of faster, smaller boats would ferry the drugs to shore. A tactic that stretched the thin resources of coast guards to their breaking point. Perhaps his most enduring logistical legacy was in the realm of money laundering. The sheer physical volume of U.S. currency generated was a problem without precedent. His cartel developed intricate systems involving front companies, shell corporations, and the bulk smuggling of cash back into Colombia, often in the same vehicles that had delivered the drugs. This necessitated the creation of parallel financial systems that operated outside the regulated banking world, a shadow economy that continues to challenge global financial authorities to this day. However, his most devastating innovations were in the arena of asymmetric warfare and political corruption. He weaponized the concept of plata o plomo into a systematic tool for institutional capture. He didn't just bribe individuals, he corrupted entire branches of government, from local police departments to the highest courts, creating a state within a state. When bribery failed, he escalated to a level of terrorism that was unprecedented for a criminal organization at the time. The use of large-scale car bombs against public and symbolic targets, like the Diaz building, was a tactic borrowed from political terrorist groups, but applied with the resources of a multinational corporation. This shifted the paradigm of what a drug cartel was capable of. They were no longer just criminal organizations to be policed, but insurgent forces to be militarily defeated. His use of teenage sicarios, recruited from the impoverished neighborhoods he controlled, created a cheap, disposable, and fiercely loyal army, indoctrinated into a culture of violence and rewarded with wealth and status. The psychological impact of these young, helmeted assassins on motorcycles, killing with impunity in broad daylight, created a unique form of urban terror. The long-term impact of these innovations is immeasurable. He forced the United States and Colombia into a level of security and intelligence cooperation that was previously unimaginable, leading to the creation of specialized task forces, the sharing of real-time intelligence, and the deployment of advanced military technology against a non-state actor. The hunt for Escobar was a proving ground for tactics and technologies that would later be used in the global war on terror. Conversely, his successes became a textbook for aspiring cartels worldwide. The Cali cartel, the Mexican drug lords, and criminal syndicates across the globe studied and refined his model of vertical integration, corruption, and violence. The sophisticated tunneling operations, the use of semi-submersibles, and the brutal intimidation of public officials that define the modern drug trade are all evolutions of the blueprint. Escobar first drafted, in a dark, unintended way. Pablo Escobar was one of the most influential figures in modern law enforcement and criminal history, not for the morality of his actions, but for the sheer, disruptive force of his innovations. He changed the game, forcing both criminals and cops to adapt to a new, more dangerous, and more complex reality, a shadowy legacy of methodology that continues to shape the hidden wars waged in the world's shadows long after his death. Beyond the staggering statistics of tons of cocaine shipped, billions of dollars laundered, and thousands of murders ordered, lies the true and enduring legacy of Pablo Escobar, the profound, incalculable, and deeply personal human cost that seeped into the very fabric of Colombian society, leaving scars that have been passed down through generations. To reduce his reign to numbers is to miss the essence of the tragedy. It is in the silent, private grief of the countless families torn apart, in the psychological trauma of a nation forced to normalize the unacceptable, and in the collective memory of a period when death could arrive arbitrarily in the form of a bomb, a motorcycle, or a whispered threat. The victims were not merely numbers on a cartel's hit list. They were judges who believed in the rule of law. Like those hundreds of magistrates murdered in a systematic campaign to annihilate the judiciary, leaving courtrooms empty and the scales of justice shattered. They were police officers, like the countless members of the search block and their families, who were hunted down in a campaign of terror designed to paralyze law enforcement. They were journalists, like the staff of El Espectador, who were bombed and assassinated for daring to report the truth, their ink replaced with blood. They were politicians with the courage to stand against him, like Rodrigo Lara Bonilla and Luis Carlos Galán, whose murders were not just killings, but direct attacks on the democratic process itself. And they were the anonymous, the collateral damage in Escobar's war, the secretaries, the drivers, the children in the DOS daycare, the passers-by on a busy street in Bogota, the 107 souls aboard Avianca Flight 203, whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time, their lives extinguished to send a political message. The trauma of this period was not a temporary affliction. It became a national condition. An entire generation of Colombians grew up with the sound of car bombs as a part of their childhood, with the sight of body armor and military checkpoints as a normal feature of the urban landscape. They learned to be cautious in their conversations, to look over their shoulders, to live with a baseline level of fear that became as common as the air they breathed. This collective PTSD manifested in a deep-seated distrust of public institutions, a cynicism towards politics, and a societal numbness to violence that would take decades to heal. The fabric of community was torn as neighbor grew wary of neighbor, and the simple act of going to work or school could feel like a life or death gamble. For the families of the victims, the pain was not a historical event. It was a lifelong sentence. Widows were left to raise children alone. Parents buried their sons and daughters. And children grew up with only photographs and stories of the parent taken from them by a faceless cartel. The psychological toll on those who fought him was equally immense. The men of the search block lived under constant threat, their own families targeted, their names on death lists, their mental health stretched to the breaking point by the horrors they witnessed daily. The story of Pablo Escobar is, at its heart, the aggregate of these millions of individual stories of loss, fear, and resilience. It is the story of a country that was held hostage not by a foreign power, but by one of its own sons, a man who exploited its weaknesses and unleashed a storm of violence upon his own people. The subsequent decades of effort to rebuild trust in institutions, to promote a culture of legality, and to address the deep social inequalities that Escobar so cynically exploited, are all part of a long and painful national recovery. The transformation of Medellín from the world's most dangerous city to a hub of innovation is a testament to this resilience, but the progress is fragile. The ghosts of that era are never fully exorcised. They linger in the memories of the survivors, in the political discourse, and in the very topography of the city, where bullet holes can still be found. In some walls and monuments stand in silent memory of the fallen. To truly understand the legacy of Pablo Escobar, one must look past the sensational headlines and the glamorized myths and listen to these quieter, more painful stories. They serve as the most powerful and necessary rebuttal to any romanticized notion of his life. A solemn reminder that the true cost of his empire was not measured in dollars, but in the shattered lives and the enduring tears of a nation. The rise and fall of Pablo Escobar cannot be fully comprehended in a vacuum. It was a dramatic and bloody chapter in the larger, ongoing geopolitical drama of the war on drugs, a conflict that placed the impoverished, politically fractured nation of Colombia at the center of a global power struggle. Escobar was not merely a criminal operating against a national government. He became a primary target in a burgeoning international crusade, a symbol of the enemy in a war declared by the most powerful nation on earth, the United States, grappling with a domestic cocaine epidemic that was ravaging its cities in the 1980s, identified the source of the problem not in its own demand, but in the foreign supply. This externalization of the issue led to a foreign policy focused on interdiction and eradication at the source, with Colombia as its primary battlefield. The Reagan and later Bush administrations poured billions of dollars in military aid, hardware, and intelligence support into the country, fundamentally reshaping the Colombian state's capacity for war, but also entangling it in a complex web of foreign policy objectives. For the U.S., Escobar was public enemy number one, a personification of the narco, threat whose capture or death became a paramount policy goal. This transformed the conflict from a national law enforcement issue into a proxy war, where Colombian police and soldiers, trained and advised by American DEA and CIA operatives, fought a Colombian citizen with American weapons and strategy, the single most potent weapon in the American arsenal, and the one Escobar feared most was extradition. The threat of being tried in a U.S. courtroom, far from the corrupting influence of his wealth and the intimidating reach of his sicarios, was the linchpin of the American strategy. It was this very threat that triggered Escobar's all-out war against the state, leading to the campaign of terrorism designed specifically to force the government to revoke the treaty. The geopolitical stakes were immense. Escobar's wealth and power challenged the very sovereignty of the Colombian state, and his ability to corrupt and intimidate at the highest levels raised fears in Washington of a potential narco state, a country where the government was effectively controlled by criminal interests. This fear dictated a militarized response, one that often overlooked the nuanced social and economic roots of the drug trade in favor of a simplistic good versus evil narrative. The American strategy, however, was not without its contradictions and moral compromises. In their single-minded pursuit of Escobar, U.S. agencies were sometimes forced into uncomfortable alliances. The collaboration with the search bloc was official policy, but the line blurred significantly with the emergence of Los Pepes. While there is no definitive evidence of direct U.S. involvement with the vigilante group, the turning of a blind eye to their activities and the likely use of the intelligence they gathered represented a pragmatic, if morally ambiguous, acceptance of extrajudicial tactics in the pursuit of a greater goal. This created a dangerous precedent, effectively sanctioning a, by any means necessary, approach that would echo in later global conflicts. Furthermore, the focus on Escobar and the Medellín Cartel had unintended geopolitical consequences. The massive pressure applied to his organization created a vacuum that was swiftly filled by the more discreet but equally powerful Cali cartel, demonstrating the balloon effect of the drug war. Squeezing one area only causes the problem to pop up elsewhere. The enormous profits generated by the trade also fueled other insurgencies plaguing Colombia, such as the FARC and ELN guerrillas, who taxed coca cultivation to fund their own revolutionary wars, further complicating the nation's internal conflict. The hunt for Pablo Escobar, therefore, was more than a manhunt. It was a pivotal moment in the internationalization of the war on drugs. It set the template for future U.S. involvement in Latin America, established the tactics and technologies for combating transnational criminal organizations, and revealed the profound limitations and brutal compromises inherent in a militarized approach to a problem deeply rooted in global economics, domestic social policy, and human addiction. Escobar became the face of this war, a larger-than-life villain whose defeat was proclaimed as a major victory. Yet his death did not stem the flow of cocaine nor end the violence. It simply reshuffled the deck in a game that continues to be played out on a global scale, with different players but the same tragic rules. The death of Pablo Escobar on the rooftop in Los Olivos did not simply mark the end of a man. It signaled the immediate and irrevocable collapse of the intricate criminal empire he had painstakingly built over 2 decades, the Medellín Cartel, an organization that had once operated with the efficiency and reach of a multinational corporation, disintegrated with stunning rapidity, its structure unable to survive the decapitation of its charismatic and tyrannical leader. The fate of its key lieutenants and associates in the aftermath paints a final, Grim picture of the world Escobar created, a world where betrayal, violence, and a desperate scramble for survival became the only constants. The cartel was never a democratic organization. It was a dictatorship held together by Escobar's force of will, his strategic genius, and the pervasive terror he instilled in both his enemies and his allies. Without him, the center could not hold. The remaining members were left exposed, hunted not only by the state, but by the vengeful forces of Los Pepes and their own former allies in the Cali cartel, who seized the opportunity to eliminate competition and absorb lucrative trafficking routes. The Oca brothers, George Luis, Juan David, and Fabio, who had been foundational partners in the cartel's early days, had already surrendered to authorities in 1990 and 1991, following a separate negotiation with the government. They had recognized the unsustainable trajectory of Escobar's war and cut a deal, receiving reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation and a promise to abandon criminal activity. Their survival and relatively lenient treatment, compared to the fate of others, highlighted the fissures that had begun to appear within the cartel's leadership long before Escobar's death. Others were not so fortunate. Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gasha, known as El Mexicano, the cartel's head of security and a man known for his own extreme brutality, had been killed in a police raid in December 1989. His death a significant early blow to the organization's military wing. The fate of those who remained loyal to the very end was often bleak. Many mid-level managers, accountants, and logistics coordinators were systematically hunted down and killed by Los Pepes in the months leading up to and following Escobar's death, their murders serving as both vengeance and a warning. Some, hoping to save themselves, turned informant, providing the search block and American agencies with the intelligence that finally cornered their former boss. The story of Pablo Escobar's hitman, John Jairo Velázquez, known as Papi, is a particularly dark illustration of this aftermath. After surrendering and serving a 22-year prison sentence for hundreds of murders, he was released and became a macabre media figure, giving detailed, chilling interviews about the cartel's operations before being murdered in 2020, a testament to the long and unforgiving memory of the underworld. The disintegration of the Medellín Cartel also had a profound impact on the city's social and economic fabric. The vast flow of narco dollars that had artificially inflated the local economy employed thousands as drivers, bodyguards, and money counters, and funded the construction projects suddenly dried up. This created an economic hangover, a period of adjustment and unemployment in a city that had grown accustomed to the illicit wealth. Furthermore, the collapse of Escobar's centralized authority led to a fragmentation of the criminal underworld. The neighborhood-based gangs that had once been under his command splintered into smaller, more numerous, and often more violent groups, fighting for control of local drug distribution, extortion rackets, and other criminal enterprises. This legacy of decentralized, street-level violence became one of Medellín's most enduring challenges in the years that followed. The ashes of Escobar's empire, therefore, did not bring peace, but a new, more chaotic form of conflict. The great, monolithic enemy was gone, replaced by a hydra of smaller, more elusive criminal entities. The fates of his associates, from the imprisoned Aqua brothers to the murdered enforcers, serve as a final epilogue to his story, demonstrating that in the world he built, there were very few happy endings, only varying degrees of downfall. The empire died with its emperor, but the seeds of criminality it had sown would germinate in the fertile soil of poverty and institutional weakness, ensuring that the shadow of Pablo Escobar would loom long over Medellín, not as a unified power, but as a fractured and enduring ghost. The story of Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, from the tombstone thief of Envigado to the corpse on a Medellín rooftop, transcends the boundaries of a single life to stand as a stark and enduring cautionary tale for the entire world, a dark parable whose lessons resonate far beyond the mountains of Colombia and the corridors of power in Washington. His narrative is a multifaceted warning, a mirror held up to the vulnerabilities of nations, the corrupting nature of absolute power, the perils of systemic inequality, and the dangerous allure of the outlaw myth. On a geopolitical level, his reign exposed the profound limitations of a purely militarized approach to the complex problem of drug trafficking. The United States and Colombia learned, at a tremendous human cost, that you cannot simply bomb or shoot your way out of a crisis fueled by immense global demand, entrenched poverty, and institutional corruption. The war on drugs, with Escobar as its primary antagonist, demonstrated the balloon effect in brutal practice, showing that eliminating one supplier or one cartel only creates a vacuum for others to fill, often with methods just as vicious and networks even more diffuse. The collaboration with shadowy vigilante groups like Los Pepes, while tactically effective in this specific case, set a dangerous precedent, blurring the lines between justice and vengeance and legitimizing extrajudicial violence as a tool of state policy in the shadows for developing nations. Escobar's story is a chilling lesson in the fragility of state institutions when confronted with the corrosive power of nearly unlimited criminal wealth. He demonstrated how a single individual, armed with billions of dollars and a complete absence of scruples, could paralyze a democracy, intimidate its press, and murder its judges, bringing a nation to the brink of becoming a narco state. His ability to do so was predicated on pre-existing conditions, a deep-seated social and economic inequality that he expertly exploited, a historical distrust of a central government perceived as elitist and distant, and a judicial system that was vulnerable to both fear and bribery. His life is a permanent warning to governments everywhere about the necessity of building robust, transparent, and inclusive institutions that serve all citizens, lest the vacuum be filled by those who offer plata o plomo. On a human level, his saga is a terrifying exploration of the psychology of power. Escobar's descent from an ambitious young man, fearful of poverty, to a genocidal narcissist who believed he could pay off a nation's debt is a masterclass in the corrupting nature of unchecked authority. His life illustrates how easily moral boundaries can erode when there is no countervailing force, and how a man can compartmentalize his reality so completely that he can be a loving father and a mass murderer in the same hour. He represents the ultimate endpoint of a philosophy that values ambition above all else, where success, measured solely in wealth and power, justifies any means. Furthermore, the global fascination with his story, the Narcos phenomenon, and the persistent narcotourism serve as a meta, cautionary tale about our own society's complicated relationship with violence and power. Our consumption of his myth risks sanitizing his atrocities, turning real human suffering into entertainment, and transforming a monster into a charismatic anti-hero. This fascination reveals an uncomfortable truth about a world often bored by nuance and drawn to the stark, dramatic lines of a rise and fall epic, even when that epic is written in the blood of thousands. The cautionary tale of Pablo Escobar is not that he was a unique monster, but that he was a human being whose particular pathologies found the perfect environment in which to flourish. He is a warning about what can happen when ambition is divorced from morality, when wealth is valued above human life, and when the social contract between a people and their government is broken. His echo endures not because he was great, but because the conditions that created him, inequality, corruption, and a boundless appetite for intoxication, remain stubbornly and perhaps eternally present in our world. His story is a ghost that continues to walk, reminding us that the potential for such darkness is never fully extinguished, and that the price of order is eternal vigilance against the seductive power of the ruthless emperor who promises the world and delivers only hell. And so, we arrive at the end of our long and harrowing journey through the life and times of Pablo Escobar, a narrative that has stretched from the modest beginnings in Rio Negro to the global cocaine empire, from the bloody battlefields of his war on the stake to the final desperate moments on a sun-drenched rooftop. We have traversed the complex landscape of his psyche, witnessed the devastating human cost of his ambition, and observed the geopolitical tremors his actions triggered across the world. The story of the ruthless emperor is now complete, but its echoes are far from silent. To look back upon this saga in its entirety is to be confronted not with a simple story of a villain, but with a profoundly unsettling tapestry of contradictions. A man who was both a monster and a benefactor, a terrorist and a folk hero, a devoted family man and a merciless killer of families. His legacy is not a single thread, but a tangled knot of shadow and light, a legacy that continues to be debated, commodified, and feared. The physical empire of cocaine and cash is long gone, dismantled by bullets, bombs, and the relentless march of time. But the cultural and psychological empire of Pablo Escobar endures. It endures in the transformed, yet still grappling city of Medellín, where his ghost is both a tourist attraction and a painful memory. It endures in the global drug trade, which adopted and refined his business model of vertical integration and systematic corruption. It endures in the collective memory of Colombia, a nation that carries the scars of his war as a permanent part of its identity, a reminder of a time when the state itself was held hostage. And it endures in the global consciousness, where his name has become a universal shorthand for a certain kind of audacious, world-changing criminality. The fundamental question his life poses is one without a simple answer. How do we, as students of history, reconcile the undeniable evil of his actions with the equally undeniable complexity of his character and the specific social conditions that allowed him to flourish? The answer lies perhaps in refusing to simplify him. To remember Pablo Escobar is to remember the totality of his story, not to glorify his violence, but to understand its mechanics, not to excuse his crimes, but to comprehend the environment that nurtured them, not to celebrate his wealth, but to acknowledge the poverty and inequality he both exploited and, in his twisted way, sought to alleviate for his own ends. His life stands as an eternal testament to the fact that the most dangerous men are not those who are purely evil, but those who are capable of great good and choose to commit great evil instead. Those who harness legitimate human desires for respect, for community, and for a better life and pervert them into an engine of destruction. As we close this chapter, the story of Pablo Escobar should serve as a permanent call to vigilance. It is a call to strengthen the institutions of justice and democracy, to address the festering wounds of social and economic inequality, and to critically examine our own consumption of violence and the narratives of power. The world that created Pablo Escobar has not vanished. It has merely changed its form. The temptations of immense, illicit wealth, the vulnerabilities of developing democracies, and the human capacity for compartmentalization and violence all remain. Therefore, the lesson of his life is not a historical artifact. It is a living, breathing warning. We must listen to the whispers of this past, lest we be doomed to hear its screams again, in a different guise, in a different time. Thank you for accompanying us on this deep and detailed exploration of one of history's most formidable and frightening figures. We hope this comprehensive narrative has provided not just facts, but context, not just a timeline, but a deeper understanding. If you found this journey into the heart of darkness enlightening, we invite you to continue exploring the complex tapestry of history with us. Please support this channel by subscribing, liking, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement allows us to continue bringing you these thorough and thought-provoking documentaries. Until our next historical deep dive, remember to reflect on the past, for in its shadows, we often find the light to guide our future.